Okay, so here we go. Ronald Reagan, and I'm just going to loop into this video, Ronald Reagan and everyone else. So Reagan is probably, through Reagan is probably where you have the biggest chance of seeing a document like on a DBQ or something. So I definitely want to make sure I hit Reagan pretty good. But then, there's always a chance you're going to see something about the Patriot Act with George W. Bush. There's always something you're going to, a chance you could hear something about the Bush v. Gore election lawsuit, something about Clinton's economic plan, something about George H.W. Bush's Persian Gulf War. So there's some high points in here after Reagan, but the big bulk of this conversation is going to be Reagan. So let's get to it. Okay, so what is a liberal and what is a conservative? This is such an important conversation to have in the 80s going forward. With Richard Nixon, we talked about how this is really the beginning of the idea of a small government conservative. And so in the 80s, you just have intensified that debate about the role of government. If you are a liberal, you tend to think government should play a role in regulating the economy, but government should not play a role in regulating social behavior. Government should help the disadvantaged, and government should actively promote and favor a diverse society. Conservatives distrust the government. They don't necessarily disagree with many of the things that liberals advocate for. They just don't believe the government should be the force responsible for securing that, right? So they want to limit it. They believe that private institutions are best suited to help the disadvantaged. And they do believe in the regulation of social behaviors. So liberalism versus conservatism, there you go. That's really at the heart of this back and forth between liberals or between Democrats and Republicans in the 80s and 90s and even today. Liberalism had dominated politics in the 1960s, right? Think Kennedy, think LBJ. But conservatives reemerge in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of it is this response to foreign threats, right? Foreign policy needs. So liberalism has grown in popularity with the New Deal. Conservatives, though, promise order, they promise stability, they promise strength. And in this Cold War era, that is very appealing. In 1955, a man named William Buckley, pictured up there in the top right, founded the that's William Buckley Jr., right, had founded the National Review. And in 1960, you have the establishment of the YAF, or Young Americans for Freedom. So you can start to see young people growing here in this idea of conservatism. And William Buckley says that the magazine, the National Review, stands athwart history, yelling stop, at a time when no one is inclined to do so, or to have much patience with those who urge it. Nixon got a lot of flack for using the term silent majority, as he should, right? However, he's not entirely incorrect. We've been talking a lot about activism. We've been talking about youth culture and counterculture and liberalism, but there are a lot of people who are saying, slow down. Government needs to pull back, right? Government needs to stop growing. Yes, the New Deal might have been helpful, but we're not in the Great Depression anymore. We don't need all these government programs. The problem is in America, of course, once you start giving things to American people, it's difficult to take those things away, right? We want more rights, not less rights. We want more access to programs, not less access to programs. So that's the tension happening here between liberals and conservatives. The Sun Belt is also going to be growing in population, and I mention this in context of the political revolution taking place, this conservative reemergence, because this growth in popularity in southern states also tends to mean a growth in conservative votership. So as that begins to populate, you start to see more industrial jobs moving south. You also start to see mainstream air conditioning and that's a big deal, right? You have to have power. Remember, TVA gives electricity for the first time to much of this region. And then after the TVA, you have the establishment of air conditioning as like a standard thing that you get when you buy a house down in the South. So that's a big deal. That's why people move down there. But after World War II, the region starts to populate more and play a larger political role. Northeast, I've mentioned there's issues related to aging industrial infrastructure in the Northeast, this old growth. The Sun Belt is where the new growth is, and those voters tend to be conservative voters. White Southerners have concerns about the civil rights movement, and Westerners have concerns about economic regulations, or environmental regulations, I should say. And so we also see the growth of the suburbs in the South, just like we do in places like Levittown in the North, and taxes. And all of those things add up to conservative. You also have the religious right becoming an important element of the Republican Party or the conservative movement. Many conservatives are troubled by Roe v. Wade. They're troubled by this advocacy for the ERA or the Equal Rights Amendment. They don't like all these long-haired hippies out there protesting everything and anything. And so you start to see these evangelical ministers take on a little bit of a political role. So you have Protestant evangelicals. There's Billy Graham, that's him on the bottom right. Televangelists like Pat Robertson on the bottom left, and Jerry Falwell in the middle. And Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell together will found something called the Moral Majority, which they almost become this political action committee. Although, not technically one, they will endorse candidates that they feel serve a further right moral agenda. So enter Ronald Reagan. Okay, so who is Ronald Reagan? Ronald Reagan is going to start out as a Democrat, a very outspoken Democrat, but because of his concerns, about communism, he eventually becomes a Republican. He had been a very prominent actor. There he is in a still from one of his Western movies. But he will eventually go on to be a two-term Republican governor of California. As a presidential candidate, he promises to cut taxes, increase defense spending. So particularly when it comes to defense spending, we're not really a small government, right? He also wants to have a constitutional amendment that would ban abortion. He says government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem, which I think a lot of people would agree with today. There's a little video that's going to play that I'm going to move quickly through because I added that video into this folder as a separate little video for you to watch.
March 30th, 1981.
Hang on. Conservatives do celebrate Ronald Reagan's election as the fulfillment of their dreams. Some even referred to his coming to power as the, quote, Reagan Revolution. The Reagan Revolution would bring a significant shift in the political direction of the nation. This is the 1980 presidential election. This is quite the landslide victory. It speaks to how ready people are for this conservative government and also how disillusioned people are with bless his heart, Jimmy Carter. Remember stagflation, though, from the end of that long video about Richard Nixon? Reagan still has to deal with stagflation that he inherits from Nixon, from Ford, from Carter. So he is going to be a supply-sider, and his brand of supply-side economics is known as Reaganomics. Supply-side economics combat stagflation, hopefully, by using high interest rates, tax cuts, and again, this idea of trickle-down economics. So trickle-down economics and supply-side economics are essentially the same thing, and this becomes known as Reaganomics. The idea that you will cut taxes for the wealthier, make the economy better for the wealthier, and then that money, that extra money that they earn, will trickle down to the rest of society. The opposite side of supply-side economics is called pump priming economics or Keynesian economics. And if you believe in pump priming, that's FDR. If you've ever gotten like a bottle of hand sanitizer, right, because COVID, let's use hand sanitizer as an example. And if it's a brand new bottle, when you first pump the bottle, nothing comes out. You've got to pump it multiple times. That's called priming the pump. And so many pump primer economists believe that it's the government's job to prime the pump of the economy, to jumpstart the economy. And then once it's jump started, you pull back a little bit, right? Like FDR and his second New Deal. But with supply side, you're not pumping, you're not priming the entire pump for the entire economy. You're just getting it going for those at the top, and you're letting it drip down or trickle down to those at the bottom. I know that this guy is very annoying, but his videos are decent, especially this one.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Use History. We're going to bang out some content for you guys. Supply side economics, also called trickle down economics. It's going to be on the exam. And if it's not on the exam, it's going to pop up in an awkward situation and we don't want you to look like an idiot. So giddy up for the learning, guys. Trickle down economics. Give me like 3 minutes and I'll grow your brain. All right, we're going to preface this by saying that I'm not advocating for this economic position, nor am I trying to disparage it. We're just trying to explain it. And if you've taken United States history up to this point in the 1980s, we're going to associate trickle-down economics with Ronald Reagan, Republicanism, George Bush, those dudes. You've already learned of kind of the opposite theory. The opposite theory is called Keynesian economics. Sometimes I'll call it pump spending. The idea that you need to have the federal government help create jobs for the poor or give some type of economic incentives to the poor, and then they'll spend that money and it kind of rises the balloon. You kind of pump the air into the bottom of the balloon and then the whole balloon rises. Well, the opposite theory is called trickle-down economics, and rather than a hot air balloon or pumping air, we're going to think of the United States as getting hungry, an ice cream cone. How about that? Look at the nice ice cream cone. And the idea is that, first of all, you want to help the whole ice cream. Both of these economic theories argue that this is the best thing for everybody in the economy. But in the ice cream cone, on the top of the ice cream, you would have kind of the elite, the upper class. Maybe Bill Gates is the cherry on top. And on the bottom of the ice cream, you kind of have the millions of toiling, kind of lower classes. And the idea is, in order to stimulate the economy, you need to take tax cuts or economic subsidies or some type of cashola and pour it on top of the ice cream. And then when you give that money back to the people who you took it from the first place, that's the argument, because they pay the highest taxes, that they're going to use that money better than the government could use it. They're going to use it to expand the factory, to give more wages to their workers, to create more product. And that, in a sense, is job creation.
Okay, so I'm moving quickly through that, but I think it gives you a good idea about supply side. The economy does begin to recover, and Reagan will win re-election in 1984. He will run against Democrat Walter Mondale and the first female vice presidential nominee, Geraldine Ferraro. The Supreme Court, Reagan makes some very conservative, some very important contributions to the Supreme Court. It's not like today where everyone is so ultra conservative or ultra liberal on the court, right? Where we think of it in terms of that. This is the age of being moderate with who you appoint to the court. But we have Sandra Day O'Connor in 1981. William Rehnquist, Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy, who will eventually be appointed as opposed to Robert Bork of Watergate fame. Reagan, in terms of foreign policy, called for what he called peace through strength, and he had a very clear goal that he believed that the Soviet economy was on the brink of collapse, and he was correct. But he also knew that if we upped our defense spending, the Soviets would up their defense spending to try to keep up with us, right? Remember, mutually assured destruction, et cetera, et cetera. And he knew that we could up our defense spending a lot more than they could afford to up theirs. And so if we just kept upping and upping and upping our spending, they would eventually bankrupt themselves. And they do. This really goes back to George Kennan in the Long Telegram. Remember, he said they're going to wait them out. They're going to collapse themselves. That's what happens with a little bit of a push here from Reagan's policies. By doing that, though, he also severely increases the deficit in the United States. It skyrockets under Reagan, not because that was his mindset, but that was because it's what he felt it would take to end the Cold War. And he's not wrong. So deficit balloons, new jobs are created on defense, and that's really probably what ends the stagflation. There are a couple of foreign policy dealings that Reagan has, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Grenada. There's a little handout that I've got in a folder that is asking you to look at those. But essentially, we are not having large-scale military engagements. We are having targeted CIA involvement in various Cold War hotspots around the world. The Iran-Contra affair, excuse me, is going to be the closest that Reagan comes to impeachment, and he is actually pretty close to being impeached over this. The first issue at play here is that his administration had sold weapons to rebels in Nicaragua, despite the fact that Congress had said, you are not allowed to sell weapons to rebels in Nicaragua, okay? The second issue is that they had paid Iran in weapons in exchange for hostages. Do you remember those hostages? Then the profits are sent to the Contras, who are the rebels in Nicaragua. So we were laundering money through Iran to Nicaragua. The general who gets in biggest trouble for this is Oliver North. He ends up taking full responsibility for the entire Iran-Contra affair. And it's unclear how much responsibility Reagan had because it's never fully investigated. He ends up allowing the appointment of a prosecutor to look into it. It is found that there was this illegal deal where guns were sold to Iran, and then those profits from those illegal gun sales were sent to the Contras in Nicaragua. Some very shady dealings are exposed. Oliver North takes the fall, and it sort of ends. And Reagan does take responsibility, but then they move on.
Well, unfortunately, their predictions were right. As I said to you in March, I let my preoccupation with the hostages intrude into areas where it didn't belong. The image,
hang on.
Well, unfortunately,
okay. We are also going to see détente come into question a little bit here, a very precarious détente under Reagan because he is more aggressive. Reagan liked something called the madman theory, where he wanted this, and so did Nixon. He wanted the Soviets to think that at any moment he would be capable of launching a nuclear weapon, which is really fascinating. He proposes some really interesting defense mechanisms, including something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, which is known as Star Wars, which involved, there it is. It involved a satellite missile defense system in space, so where if the Soviets launched something at us, we could defend ourselves from space, which people made fun of, but it's also kind of cool. But it was crazy. It would be crazy expensive, right? In 1985, the Soviets get a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. He understands that he can't keep pace with U.S. spending, and so we start to see an increase in armament treaties, like SALT. And then in December of 1987, the INF Treaty, or the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. We also have the beginning of Glasnost and Perestroika. Both of them have to do with a relaxing of tensions, and opening of the government to democracy. No, they're not becoming a democracy. I don't want you to think that, but they are allowing more freedoms in their society, and also perestroika, which has to do with the economy. So we're going to start establishing some trade relationships with Soviets. I'm not going to play this entire video. Okay.
Thank you very much. Chancellor Kohl, Governing Mayor Deepkin, ladies and gentlemen, 24 years ago, President John F. Kennedy visited Berlin. And speaking to the people of this city and the world at the City Hall, well, since then, 2 other presidents have come, each in his turn, to Berlin. And today, I myself make my second visit to your city. We come to Berlin, we American, perhaps the comfort of nach einen Koffer in Berlin, Europe, Berlin towers. But today, Today I say, as long as this gate is closed, as long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind.
And he goes on to say, tear down this wall. He goes on to say, please tear down this wall. And he's talking, of course, about the Berlin Wall. So I mentioned perestroika. I mentioned glasnost. After Gorbachev resigns the presidency, he becomes prime minister. We'll have a new president of the USSR, Boris Yeltsin. There he is in the middle. And we do see the Berlin Wall torn down.
Good evening,
I'm
everyone.
definitely not playing this. I just kind of want to
And
see.
cheers.
To open a road closed 28 years by morning.
They are removing the wall. So I'm going to pause here, and then we will pick up with part 2 really quick.